My grandfather left me a strange inheritance and told me not to share it with my uncle. Now I know why. And then, I'm Jake, 27 years old, and I've just come from the reading of my grandfather's will. My grandfather, Harold, passed away a few weeks ago at the age of 83, leaving behind a legacy that I'd thought was defined by his kindness and wisdom. To me, he was the epitome of strength and mystery, always telling me stories about our family history with a certain twinkle in his eye. We were close, closer than I was with most people in my life. But nothing he ever told me could have prepared me for what I discovered today. My dad passed away when I was a kid, so my grandfather had been the closest thing to a father figure. Growing up, I spent countless weekends at his place, listening to him tell tales of his youth, his travels, and his experiences in a way that felt almost mythical. He'd talk about his own parents, my great-grandparents, and the business they started from the ground up, which went on to provide for our family for generations. Even as he grew older, Harold was sharp, with a mind like a steel trap, and I was always in awe of his intelligence. But his stories about the family business, some kind of mining venture back in the day, were always vague, more legend than fact. Whenever I'd ask about specific details, he'd get this quiet, distant look, and I knew it was the end of the conversation. One of the surprises of the will reading was how little my Uncle Ray, Harold's only other child, was mentioned. Ray, 55, had been present, sitting across the room, his face a mask of indifference, though he'd always been somewhat distant from me. I didn't have much of a relationship with Ray. He was quiet, withdrawn, and we'd never been close. But Harold's instructions regarding Ray left me unsettled. When the lawyer pulled out a small, sealed box with my name on it, I immediately knew it was from Harold. And with it came a letter in his familiar, spidery handwriting, which read, "For Jake. Keep this safe and do not, under any circumstances, allow your Uncle Ray to know its contents." Ray's expression didn't change as the lawyer handed the box to me, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was as if he knew something I didn't, but he was too proud, or maybe too resentful, to show it. I thanked the lawyer, nodded to Ray, and left the office as quickly as possible, feeling the weight of the box in my hands. When I got home, I placed the box on my dining table, staring at it for a while. It wasn't large, only about the size of a shoebox, and it was carefully sealed with an old-fashioned wax emblem bearing our family crest, a design I'd seen before on my grandfather's stationery but had never really noticed until now. I took a deep breath and turned to the letter again, feeling the familiar twinge of my grandfather's presence as I read his words. The letter was short, but the language was cryptic and made me uneasy. It said, "Jake, this inheritance is not like anything else I could give you. Inside this box lies a piece of our family's history that was meant only for you. It's a story that's been hidden, one I didn't even share with your father. And whatever you do not share this with Ray. He must never know." The last words were underlined, as if he were trying to warn me about something serious, something that went beyond simple family secrets. I hesitated. I'd always trusted Harold, but this was strange. Keeping something secret from Ray? I'd never known them to be close, but I couldn't recall any particular reason for Harold's distrust. My grandfather had a strong sense of family. He'd always instilled that in me. This secrecy didn't feel like him, and I could almost hear him saying it, in that low, somber tone he used when he wanted me to really listen. After a few minutes of hesitation, I carefully broke the wax seal on the box and lifted the lid. Inside, I found a strange collection of items, things that felt like remnants of a distant past. There were several envelopes, each filled with what looked like old, yellowed documents, and a small, dark blue leather-bound notebook, worn and fraying at the edges. Beneath the notebook was a folded, faded map that looked like it had been pulled from an ancient atlas. And finally, a bundle of black and white photographs, some of which looked like they'd been taken decades ago. I opened the notebook first, drawn to it instinctively. The first few pages contained rough sketches of mountains and rivers, their edges smudged as if they'd been drawn in haste. There were dates scrawled in the margins, most of them from the 1960s, and a few initials I didn't recognize. As I flipped through, I came across a series of cryptic notes. Phrases like "the fortune buried within" and "promises not kept." My heart raced as I realized that this wasn't just a journal. It was a record of something more, something Harold had kept hidden for years. Turning the page, I found a passage that left me staring, wide-eyed. The deal went sour. I never should have trusted him. Ray wanted more than his share, and when he didn't get it, he promised he'd ruin us. I stopped, feeling the words sink in. This was written in my grandfather's handwriting, but he'd never mentioned anything like this to me. As far as I knew, the business had passed peacefully to Harold, and he'd held it until he retired. This hinted at something darker, a family feud that had remained unspoken. I opened one of the envelopes next, and inside, I found a collection of legal documents, some of which referenced an old business name, Pine Valley Mining Company. The documents detailed a partnership agreement between Harold and another individual, initials RT, which had to be Ray. It seemed that at one point, Ray had been involved in the family business, something Harold had never told me. One paper, a dissolution agreement, looked particularly unsettling. Scrawled in the margins was a note in my grandfather's handwriting. Paid what he demanded. Still wanted more. As I examined the map, I realized it wasn't just any map. It marked several locations across a mountain range, all circled in red, with small annotations indicating potential drilling or digging spots. Some of the locations were marked with symbols I didn't recognize, but others had labels like abandoned and hazardous. I traced the lines with my finger, trying to understand what it all meant. This was clearly part of the mining operation, but why was it hidden from Ray? What had gone so wrong between them? I couldn't stop myself from picking up the photos next. They showed a young Harold, standing with several other men in mining gear, each of them solemn and serious, the harsh sunlight casting deep shadows across their faces. In one photo, I recognized a younger Ray, glaring off camera, looking tense and angry. It was the first time I'd seen a hint of animosity between them, something Harold had managed to keep hidden all these years. By the time I closed the box, my mind was racing. This inheritance wasn't money or property. It was a secret, one that Harold had guarded carefully and decided to entrust to me. And for some reason, he wanted it kept from Ray, even after his death. I thought back to every conversation I'd had with my uncle, every time he'd spoken about my grandfather with that slight bitterness in his voice, a bitterness I'd never understood until now. Ray's presence at the will reading, his expression cold and detached, suddenly made sense. He must have known there was something Harold had hidden from him, something he'd been denied. But why? And why did my grandfather trust me with this secret instead? I looked down at the collection of artifacts from my grandfather's life and realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever Harold had kept hidden, whatever he'd meant for me to discover, went far deeper than I'd thought. And I had a feeling that as I unraveled this mystery, I would start to understand why he'd told me to keep it away from Ray. As I sat in my small apartment, the box open on the table in front of me, I felt the weight of my grandfather's secrets pressing down. Each document and photo told a part of the story, but I still couldn't piece together what had happened between him and my Uncle Ray. It was as if the box held fragments of a hidden life, a version of Harold I'd never known. And if the journal, letters, and maps were any indication, this hidden life was darker and far more complex than I'd ever imagined. I picked up the worn leather journal again, my fingers grazing the faded initials on the front cover. HB inside. I found entries dating back to the early 1960s, when Harold was young and full of ambition. He described the excitement of discovering new mining sites, the promise of wealth, and the pride he felt in building a family business from scratch. But there were darker passages too, entries where his handwriting grew erratic, as if he'd scrawled them in anger or desperation. The closer I read, the clearer it became that Ray was central to the turmoil that had haunted Harold's later years. One entry stood out. Dated February 4, 1972, it read, "Ray demanded his fair share again. He has no idea what this business requires, no patience for the work it takes. He only sees dollar signs, not the risks, not the hard choices. But he won't listen. He's convinced I'm hiding something from him. His resentment festers like a wound. I fear it'll drive him to ruin us both." Reading those words felt eerie. I'd only ever known Ray as a reserved, quiet man. Even during the will reading, his face had been expressionless, his gaze distant. But according to my grandfather's journal, Ray had once been filled with anger and suspicion, believing Harold was holding out on him. And from the look of it, Ray had been right. Harold was keeping something from him. I could almost feel the tension between them as I read, the strain of a relationship that had been scarred by secrets and distrust. As I leafed through more of the journal, I found another passage that made my heart pound. He knows about Pine Valley, or suspects as much. If he ever finds out what's there, what I did to protect it, I can't let him. It would destroy him. I only hope Jake never has to know the truth. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I stopped reading, chills running down my spine. Pine Valley. That name had come up before, in the documents I'd found. It was the name of the family's mining company. Harold had kept something buried there, something he'd protected all his life. But why? And what was he so afraid of? I reached for one of the envelopes, hoping it would shed some light on the mystery. Inside, I found a collection of letters, some of them addressed to Harold and others written by him. They were mostly formal, discussions about business matters and finances. But as I read through them, I noticed certain phrases repeated over and over. Protect our interests, maintain secrecy, ensure Ray's exclusion. It was as if Harold had systematically arranged to keep Ray out of whatever he was doing with the family business. One of the letters was from a lawyer, dated from the late 1970s. It contained a legal document formalizing a buyout, Harold paying Ray a hefty sum in exchange for relinquishing all claims to Pine Valley Mining Company. Scrawled in the margin in Harold's handwriting were the words, "He took the money, but he'll never forgive me for it. Not as long as he suspects I kept something back." My grandfather had managed to cut Ray out of the business altogether, paying him off to ensure he couldn't return. I couldn't imagine the bitterness that must have fueled such a decision, especially considering Harold's loyalty to family. But the more I read, the more I began to understand that he'd felt it necessary to protect something, and that something was valuable enough to cost Ray his legacy. The more I learned, the deeper my curiosity grew. But I was reaching a dead end with just these letters and journal entries. I needed more context, someone who could fill in the gaps. I thought back to my grandfather's old friend Bill. He'd been around during Harold's mining days and had often come by to visit when I was young, sharing drinks and stories with Harold late into the night. If anyone knew more about Pine Valley and what had gone wrong between Harold and Ray, it would be Bill. I called him the next day, and after some catching up, I hesitated before bringing up the real reason for my call. "Bill, I found something of my grandfather's, a journal, letters. They talk about Pine Valley and about some kind of falling out with Ray. I was hoping you could tell me more about what happened back then." Bill was quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, cautious. "Jake, your grandfather was a good man, and he made a lot of hard choices to protect his family. But the Pine Valley days weren't easy. There were things he never talked about, even with me. But I need to know, Bill," I insisted. "There's something he wanted me to keep secret from Ray, something he was protecting. And I need to understand why." After a long pause, Bill sighed. "All right, Jake. I'll tell you what I know. Meet me tomorrow at the diner, around noon. But just know that some stories are better left in the past." The following day, I met Bill at the old diner where he and my grandfather used to take me for breakfast on Sundays. As he stirred his coffee, Bill's gaze was distant, as if he were seeing things from decades ago. "Your grandfather and Ray started Pine Valley together. They had big plans, but they were different men, with different visions. Harold was steady, careful. Ray was impulsive, always looking for shortcuts." He took a sip, letting the silence linger before continuing. "They were working one of the biggest sites they'd ever found, a place rich with resources, deep in the mountains. But there was an accident, a bad one. Lost a few men. Ray blamed Harold for it, said he cut corners on safety. It was ugly, a lot of anger and resentment on both sides. That accident was what split them. Ray tried to take Harold to court, but Harold won the case." I was stunned. My grandfather had never mentioned any of this to me. He'd always painted the family business as a legacy of hard work, not a story marred by tragedy and betrayal. "After that," Bill went on, "Ray was out. Harold bought him off and kept the company going on his own, but the business never fully recovered. It was like a ghost haunted him after that, one he could never shake. He talked about it sometimes, late at night, but he never gave me the details. What about the inheritance? I asked. Did Ray ever try to come back for it? Bill nodded, his gaze sharpening. He never gave up on the idea that Harold owed him something. There were rumors that Harold had struck a hidden vein, a fortune he'd kept buried. Ray's always believed Harold was hiding it from him, even if there was never any proof. The word struck me like a revelation. That must have been what Harold meant in the journal when he mentioned promises not kept and buried secrets. The inheritance he'd left me, it wasn't just money. It was a legacy that Ray believed should have been his, a fortune hidden away somewhere in Pine Valley. As I left the diner, my mind was spinning. My grandfather had entrusted me with this secret, but it was clear that Ray wasn't done searching for it. He was convinced that Harold had robbed him, and he was still looking for his piece of the family's wealth. Now, I understood why Harold had warned me to keep this inheritance hidden. I'd opened a door that I couldn't close, and if Ray found out what I had, I knew he wouldn't hesitate to take drastic steps to get it. Bill's words stayed with me long after I left the diner. The story of Pine Valley was more tragic than I'd expected, and knowing it changed how I saw my grandfather. The man who'd taught me everything I knew about honesty and hard work had also harbored dark secrets, a hidden fortune, a family tragedy, and a ruthless feud with his own brother. And the most unsettling part was Ray. I'd never known my uncle well, and he'd always seemed a distant, almost neutral figure, but now I couldn't shake the image Bill had painted. A man driven by bitterness, someone who might still be searching for a way to claim what he believed he was owed. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I went home and opened the box again. I pulled out the journal and skimmed through the entries, hoping I'd find something I'd missed. The entries confirmed Bill's story, albeit in fragmented pieces. I read accounts of the accident, the lawsuits, and Harold's feelings of betrayal. There were entries where Harold seemed almost haunted, describing the accident as a dark stain on the family, a weight he'd carried alone. He'd written that Ray had pushed him too far, that his demands were driven by greed, not justice. But none of this explained why Harold had continued to keep his remaining assets hidden. Setting the journal aside, I reached for the stack of legal documents I'd found in the envelope. Most were dry financial records, full of numbers and terms I barely understood. But then I found a document with the heading Dissolution Agreement in bold letters. It was dated a few years after the accident, and it outlined the terms of Ray's exit from the business. According to the agreement, Ray had been paid a significant sum to cut all ties with Pine Valley. In exchange, he'd relinquished any claims to the company's assets. My grandfather's name was signed neatly at the bottom, alongside Ray's scrawl, which looked more like a jagged line than a signature. But there was more. The final paragraph contained a clause I hadn't noticed before, something that struck me as suspicious. It stated that all future earnings or discoveries made under Pine Valley's name would belong solely to Harold, regardless of Ray's past involvement. If Harold had found a new, profitable vein or hidden assets after the accident, Ray wouldn't have had any claim to them. It was a clean break, a legal wall that my grandfather had built to ensure Ray couldn't come back to claim anything later. A surge of realization hit me. If my inheritance was tied to these assets, then it meant that Harold had kept the business running under the radar, potentially striking a hidden fortune without ever telling Ray. Maybe he'd continued mining in secret, keeping the profits in silence, while Ray had been left in the dark. It was an unsettling thought, that Harold might have lived the rest of his life keeping this wealth a secret, only to leave it to me, with explicit instructions to keep it away from Ray. The implications left me both excited and uneasy. I felt as if I were caught in the middle of a story my grandfather had crafted years ago, a secret legacy he'd passed to me for reasons I still didn't fully understand. But if my inheritance truly involved hidden wealth, then I'd have to be careful. I understood now why Harold had given me such strict instructions. If Ray found out that there was still something left of Pine Valley, something valuable, he wouldn't let it go. Bill's warning echoed in my mind. Ray never gave up on the idea that Harold owed him something. I spent the next few days in a state of constant alertness, half expecting Ray to show up unannounced or call, but he didn't. I tried to go about my life, but the weight of the box and its secrets stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Ray somehow knew I'd uncovered something valuable. It wasn't just paranoia. I'd noticed Ray had been reaching out more since the reading of the will, asking to meet up for coffee or check in, which was strange for a man who'd barely spoken to me for years. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, I decided to visit Harold's old property, a small cabin nestled deep in the woods on the outskirts of town. It was where he'd gone to escape when life got too stressful, a place filled with quiet solitude. It struck me that if he'd hidden anything, it might be there, safe from prying eyes and away from Ray's reach. I made the hour-long drive to the cabin, arriving as the sun was setting. The place was untouched since his passing, the air thick with the smell of pine and old wood. I felt a pang of nostalgia as I stepped inside, remembering the weekends I'd spent here with Harold, listening to his stories as we sat by the fire. But this time, my purpose was different. I was here to find whatever it was he'd left hidden from the world. I searched the cabin carefully, starting with his old desk and the bookshelves that lined the walls. After hours of combing through drawers and lifting up floorboards, I was starting to feel defeated. But then I noticed a loose plank in the wall near the fireplace. It looked like it had been pried open and set back in place. My heart pounded as I reached out, pulling it away to reveal a narrow, hidden compartment behind it. Inside, I found another sealed envelope with my name on it, along with a small, rusted key attached to a tag that read Pine Valley. The envelope contained another letter from Harold, written in his familiar handwriting. His words felt like a message from beyond the grave, a final piece of guidance that he'd left for me alone. The letter read, "Jake, if you're reading this, then you've chosen to follow the trail I left. I hope by now you understand why I kept things from Ray. The assets I secured were never meant to be his. He'd only destroy them. There's a storage unit under my name at Pine Valley's old site. This key will get you inside. Use it wisely and remember, this isn't just wealth. It's our family's legacy, something I protected all these years. Guard it well." I stared at the letter, feeling a strange mix of awe and anxiety. I had the answer I'd been looking for, the final piece of my inheritance. But Harold's words only added to my sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about money. It was about preserving something my grandfather had dedicated his life to, a legacy he'd kept safe at great personal cost. And now it was mine to protect. The next day, I made my way to Pine Valley. The old mining site was long abandoned, a relic of another era, with crumbling buildings and rusted equipment left scattered across the property. I found the storage unit exactly where Harold's letter had described, tucked away near the edge of the property, hidden behind an overgrown thicket. Using the rusted key, I unlocked the storage unit, my pulse racing as the door creaked open. Inside, I found what Harold had left for me, shelves lined with boxes of documents, ledgers filled with accounts of the business, and, most shockingly, a small safe, which contained a handful of gold bars and old coins. It was a modest fortune, but enough to ensure the family's stability for generations. As I stared at the contents of the safe, I finally understood the weight of Harold's trust. He'd built this legacy on his own terms, kept it safe from Ray's reach, and passed it on to me with the hope that I'd protect it. I closed the safe and locked the unit, feeling both the thrill of discovery and the burden of responsibility. But as I walked back to my car, one thought lingered in my mind. Ray wouldn't stop looking, and now that I knew the truth, I'd have to be ready for whatever might come next. The thought of the hidden assets weighed heavily on me, and Ray's recent attempts to reach out made me uneasy. Since the reading of the will, he'd been more persistent, sending me text after text, each one growing shorter and more direct. At first, they were innocuous enough, just a request to catch up over coffee, asking if I'd looked further into Grandpa's belongings. But after I'd found the storage unit and Harold's hidden wealth, his messages had taken a more unsettling tone. I'd started getting the distinct feeling that he knew there was more to my inheritance than I'd initially let on. "Let's talk." Soon, read his last message, which I'd received early that morning. I stared at it, wondering if meeting him was a mistake, but the tension was becoming unbearable. Maybe it was time to confront Ray, get some answers of my own, and find out how much he really knew. I texted him back, telling him I'd meet him at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, hoping the public setting would prevent things from escalating. Ray arrived shortly after I did, looking calm but with a strange intensity in his eyes that made me feel as if he'd come here with a purpose. We sat across from each other, and I could sense the unspoken tension hanging between us. "So, have you been?" Ray asked, his tone deceptively casual. His eyes, however, held a sharpness that told me this wasn't just a friendly chat. "I've been busy," I replied, my voice steady. I didn't want to reveal anything yet, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me, as if he were trying to read every subtle twitch and hesitation. Ray leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Jake, I know you're not telling me everything. Harold left you more than just some old trinkets, didn't he?" His words were laced with accusation, his tone no longer casual. I hesitated, debating whether to brush him off or confront him directly. But before I could respond, he continued, his voice growing sharper. "Look, I know my father. He was never one to let go of things so easily. Whatever's in that box of yours isn't just sentimental garbage, is it? I'd bet there's a reason he told you to keep it from me." I swallowed, my mind racing. There was no point in denying it now. "If you know so much, then tell me, why did Grandpa cut you out? Why did he go to such lengths to keep everything hidden from you?" Ray's expression shifted, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something dark in his eyes. "Because he was a liar, Jake. He cheated me out of what should have been mine. After the accident, he left me to drown. My own brother left me with nothing, while he kept his secrets and his fortune." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, and his words made me realize just how deeply this resentment went. But his version of events didn't sit right with me. From everything I'd read in Grandpa's journal, Harold had been protective, driven not by greed, but by a need to keep Ray away from something he believed Ray would destroy. I could see now that Harold's warning hadn't been about selfishness. It had been about Ray's fixation on claiming something he believed was his, even if it meant tearing the family apart. "Ray, whatever happened between you and Grandpa, it's in the past. He made his choices for a reason, and maybe it's time to let it go." Ray's expression twisted into a sneer. "Let it go? You don't know a damn thing, Jake. You're just a kid, blindly defending him without knowing the truth. He stole from me, from our family, and you're too naive to see it." The conversation was spiraling, and I could sense the anger building in Ray. He was leaning closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think I don't know what he left you?" he whispered. "I know about the hidden assets. I know he had a stash somewhere, something he kept from everyone. I don't know what it is yet, but you're going to tell me, Jake. Because if you don't, I'll find it myself." A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't just bitter. He was desperate, and I could see that his motives were far darker than I'd realized. The greed that had driven him all these years was still alive, and it burned in his gaze as he watched me, waiting for my reaction. In that moment, I fully understood why my grandfather had warned me to keep the inheritance from Ray. This wasn't just a feud, it was an obsession, one that had consumed Ray's life and could easily consume mine if I wasn't careful. I forced myself to keep calm, meeting his gaze. "I'm sorry, Ray, but whatever you're looking for, it's not yours. Grandpa left it to me for a reason, and I'm going to honor his wishes." Ray's face hardened, his voice a low growl. "Is that so? Don't make this harder than it has to be, Jake. I'm not above doing what's necessary to get what's mine." His words hung heavy, a threat cloaked in thinly veiled anger. I felt my pulse quicken, realizing just how far he might go. But I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. "Stay out of this, Ray. Grandpa made his choice. If you're going to keep living in the past, that's your problem. But I'm done here." Without waiting for his response, I stood and walked out of the coffee shop, not daring to look back. My heart raced as I got into my car, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to drive straight to the storage unit and move everything. Ray's threat echoed in my mind, a reminder of the lengths he might go to if he believed he could still claim what he thought was rightfully his. As I drove away, I realized that my grandfather's warning had been more than just a request. He'd seen this side of Ray, had known the darkness that lay beneath his calm exterior, and had entrusted me with the task of protecting our family's legacy. And now, with Ray aware of its existence, I had no choice but to act. That evening, I contacted a lawyer, explaining the situation and taking steps to secure the assets. I needed to ensure that everything my grandfather had left me would be legally protected. As I hung up, I felt a sense of relief, knowing that I'd taken action, that I was safeguarding the legacy Harold had passed down. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The sense of urgency returned as I went back to the box one last time, hoping that anything left in there might help me protect what my grandfather had entrusted to me. Digging through the remaining items, my fingers brushed against something hard and cold at the bottom. A small metal key with a tag that read Harborview Storage Number 17. Next to it, folded neatly, was a faded map, annotated in my grandfather's handwriting. The map traced the route to a storage facility near the old Pine Valley site. This must be where Harold had hidden the final part of the inheritance. I drove there without a second thought, fueled by the memory of Ray's threat and the urgency of securing whatever legacy my grandfather had fought so hard to protect. The storage facility was tucked away, a plain, nondescript building lined with rusting, corrugated metal doors. Unit number 17 sat at the very end of the row, its lock slightly worn but still intact. As I unlocked the door and lifted the metal shutter, a musty, old scent filled the air. Inside, stacked carefully, were several metal trunks and a small safe. My heart raced as I opened the first trunk, uncovering rows of gold bars, their surfaces gleaming dully under the dim light. Next to the gold were smaller boxes filled with antique jewelry, diamond brooches, delicate pearl necklaces, rings encrusted with precious stones. This was wealth accumulated over a lifetime, preserved and hidden away. Harold had left it all here, out of reach from anyone who might have tried to take it from him. The small safe at the back of the unit held even more documents, including deeds and records of my grandfather's rightful ownership of the assets, each paper signed and notarized, proof that everything here was legally his, and now mine. I felt a wave of pride and sadness, understanding that this wasn't just an inheritance. It was my grandfather's last, defiant stand to preserve his family's hard-won legacy. Knowing the stakes, I took the evidence to my lawyer that afternoon and filed to secure the inheritance formally. We moved quickly, putting everything into a trust under my name, making sure Ray would have no legal path to lay claim to any of it. With every step, I felt a bit of Harold's burden lift from my shoulders, as if by securing this legacy, I was honoring his life's work and the sacrifices he'd made. But news travels fast, and I knew it wouldn't be long before Ray found out. My phone rang just as I left the lawyer's office, and sure enough, it was Ray. I hesitated, then answered, bracing myself. "Jake," he began, his voice cold and deliberate. "I know what you've done. You think you can just go behind my back and steal what's mine?" "Ray, it's over," I replied, keeping my tone steady. Grandpa's wishes were clear. Everything he left was meant for me, and it's all legally secured. You don't have any claim to it. A tense silence followed, then a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. "You're a fool if you think a piece of paper can protect you. Harold stole that from me, and you're just his puppet, carrying on his lies." "Enough, Ray," I said, cutting him off. "You're the one who pushed him away. He tried to give you a fair chance, but you threw it back in his face. This isn't just about the money for you. It's about a grudge you've held onto for decades." His voice turned venomous. "You don't know a damn thing, kid. Harold twisted you just like he twisted everyone else. You'll never understand what he stole from me." Before he could continue, I hung up, feeling the weight of his bitterness settle like a dark cloud. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me felt sorry for him. Ray had spent his life chasing shadows, driven by anger and resentment, believing that his happiness was tied to something that had never been his. But now, his last chance to claim it was gone. A few days later, Ray showed up at my door. His face was contorted with anger, his fists clenched as if he was barely restraining himself. "You think you're untouchable now?" he spat, his voice a low growl. "I won't let you get away with this, Jake." I looked him in the eyes, standing my ground. "This is done, Ray. It's time you let it go before you lose any more of yourself to this grudge." Grandpa wanted this legacy protected, and I intend to honor that. Ray's eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then he stepped back, his expression hardening. You'll regret this. Mark my words. But I didn't flinch. Maybe you're the one who'll regret it, I replied quietly. You've spent so long resenting what you didn't get that you never appreciated what you did have. That's not something I can help you with, Ray sneered, muttering something under his breath before turning and walking away. I watched as he stormed off, feeling a strange sense of closure. The man who tried to intimidate me, who'd harbored a grudge against my grandfather for decades, was now nothing more than a shadow in my past. In the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. I moved the contents of the storage unit into secure holdings and took steps to ensure that my grandfather's legacy would remain protected, far from the reach of anyone who would use it for harm. The weight of his secrets no longer felt burdensome. Instead, I felt honored to carry on his story, to safeguard the legacy he'd fought so hard to build. And in the quiet moments, I could almost hear his voice, a final reassurance that I'd done right by him. Harold's inheritance was more than wealth. It was a testament to resilience, a reminder of what it meant to protect what truly mattered, even at great personal cost. And though I still felt the echoes of Ray's bitterness, I knew that, for the first time, our family's legacy was finally safe.